A quiet day in the office, so I'm using the opportunity to share a few thoughts. The email that reached my inbox was from someone saying that there would be so few training offers for people who are not psychologists or therapists. And yes, that is true. And we could basically end the whole discussion there and say, yeah, well, okay, there is not a lot out there. But I do think that sheds light on a wider topic or problem. I do have a quite special perspective on that because I am offering, or have been part of a team that has been offering these kind of trainings when it comes to psychological trauma, how to deal with it, how to what you have to know about it, and also what are practical means and tools that you could apply in your work as a volunteer, as a social worker, as a teacher, and so on. So when you work with vulnerable human beings for a couple of years now. And that has been very gratifying and satisfying in the sense of whenever I worked with a group or when I was seeing the work that has been done by colleagues, that this is an amazing work, and the feedback is overwhelmingly fantastic, and people feel very empowered that they can do this. So good and fine. But now I'm observing the landscape of what are the offers out there and how much is there and how much is then actually implemented since half a decade at least. And I cannot say that the methods which are, I would say, easy to learn, or at least it's reasonable, like you have a reasonable time and effort in order to learn highly effective methods to stabilize, for example, to emotionally stabilize people or groups. But it is then not being done. So there is a general tendency for people preferring to know things, to have knowledge. There is this term of being trauma-informed. So you know about things, you know about background and mechanisms, and then you are supposed to act differently. And this is all good and fine, but we shouldn't stop there. It's just too little just to know about things, and then that might have a very indirect, slight influence on what you're doing without having specific techniques and methods, and without creating the organizational space and the opportunity for you to really intervene and conduct sessions, so to speak, be it with individuals or groups. So I do think we're still missing huge opportunities of helping people and giving people what they really, truly, actually need. And I can only describe the resistance or the non-existence of why is there not a movement making these methods more available. I mean, if you read the background of what I'm doing on emotioncoaching.net on the website, then you see that I have basically not invented anything that I teach, except for I do have, of course, a lot of routine using the techniques and have a certain amount of experience, which leads me to probably perform the techniques and methods in a very specific way that other people might do different. And of course, I might be able to handle a bit more complex situations differently than when you just learn the techniques and try them out a few times. But apart from that, I have not invented anything fundamental there. So all the stuff has been out there and is out there since quite a while, and sometimes it surprises me again and again, and sometimes, to be honest, it makes me very angry to see what the actual need is on the ground and how little of that is being implemented and done. And of course, I have in many conversations again and again been reflecting about what the causes of that might be, what are the conscious and subconscious resistances to doing things, and I've already spoken in other videos also about that, you know. The preference to staying on the rational level and on the talking level, like the whole let's talk about it, but let's not get to work. This is a thing which I believe we cannot afford. Not with good consciousness can we only talk about trauma and not give people the means to actually deal with it. Yes, for many situations you need a therapist and you need the setting of psychotherapy. This is out of question. But in many situations, like for example, but not exclusively, the situation when you're dealing with populations, larger populations, refugee camps, and so on and so forth, it is just an illusion to say that you will make available psychotherapy to these people in the quantity that they need it. It is just, it's never gonna happen. I'll never say never, but not within a reasonable time frame. So people suffer unnecessarily, and a very old idea, and when I say idea, it's an idea because I had it with Charlotte Baltrusch, who was and is co-founder of Healing Souls International, my other NGO, apart from emotion coaching. We had this idea, which of course came also from the influence of other people, to say certain aspects or certain things that therapists do can be taken over by non-therapists. A little bit like a doctor would delegate certain routine and basic and safe interventions and safe measures to a nurse. Of course, that person has to be trained. You cannot, somebody who has absolutely no clue of what they're doing, go about and do certain things. But like in a similar way, like we teach everybody who's driving a car to have a training in first aid, there is a way to select those interventions and those methods which can be conducted safely by someone who is not a psychologist or therapist, and make courses out of that. So out of that came the model of trauma assistant. This was a term that we created because you, of course, in the end, you have to give it a name. And so we called this trauma assistant, and that was basically a person who was not a psychologist therapist, but had been undergoing a certain volume of training. And I think the important thing here is that it is not just to be trauma informed. It is not just that you have like definitions and concepts and know some statistics and you know what and how. Yes, you have to know that too, but we didn't end there. Like under the guidance of Dr. Baltrusch, who is a seasoned trauma therapist, I experienced how it is absolutely feasible and possible that concretely the methods that are stabilizing and the whole protocol that leads to emotional stabilization of distressed and traumatized individuals can be done by people who are not therapists, because you do not have to do the trauma exposure. You don't have to do that. In so many situations, that is not what is crucially important. It's the stabilization that comes always first. So I think this is a very important concept, and sadly, it seems to me that a lot of that knowledge that should be more widely available is being kept exclusive, and there are very high barriers in order to learn certain techniques. To learn stabilization, you do not have to be a psychologist, please. I mean, you can turn it around. What do you do to people if you do not have stabilization methods? And to give you an example that might surprise you, let me use the example of journalism. I have the highest respect for journalists, for correspondents who basically shed light on stories that are important for the world to hear. And very often, stories are traumatic. And I remember very concretely a video example. I mean, there's so many, but one example from a Rohingya woman who was in Cox's Bazar, like the huge refugee camp for mainly Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh from Myanmar. And the correspondent, or the journalist, was sitting there talking to a woman who had been raped multiple times and her baby had been thrown in the fire. It was a very stark example. She told that narrative, that story, and then the film crew kept the camera on when she had an absolute emotional breakdown, understandably. So now you can, of course, have a whole discussion in like how much these kind of things should be shown or not, but I don't want to go into this. The aspect I want to make you aware of is that looking at the journalist, like how helpless he was. I mean, he got obviously something that the world needed to know, you could argue, but he was totally helpless being confronted with this extreme pain. And of course, then you're in the conflict of balancing, like what good is it to bring the story out in the world, and how large is the damage you're causing as a correspondent or journalist in order to get the story? And that's a real question, because re-traumatization is real, and every experience, re-experiencing that is, at least I would call it unnecessary pain. So I do have, of course, as you can see, mixed feelings about that contribution, but I'm in no way pointing fingers here. I'm just feeling we should learn from what's happening, and from that. Journalists obviously are in a conflict there. And I remember a situation where I was remotely stabilizing a crew of filmmakers who were doing a documentary about victims of human trafficking and sexual exploitation in India. And that film crew got then in touch with me, and I could stabilize them, because only after a few days of filming they were emotionally exhausted. And one aspect of that is this helplessness of, they did interviews with victims who were still in the situation. You know, they were not like liberated from it, but they were still in it. So that the helplessness that you experience is even much larger than when it is over, so to speak, which in the case of the Rohingya Muslims is a whole another question, if that is over or not. And so, and then I feel this incredible responsibility then, after what I have learned and what I see, what works, in how you can reduce pain in people, to make that available. So the current situation of the project is, as of now, I mean, most of the things I've been talking about right now are basically timeless, but that is a current update. Is I'm right now implementing as much as I know about, the basic fundamentals, like the basic tools, how anybody who works with human beings should act, and what is possible with very, very simple means. And my vision has always been to make that available for free. But after all, I'm running an organization, so I'm running a non-profit, and non-profit doesn't mean that you can have you still have to pay some bills. And so there will be a level up from the free and basic available material. So if you want to learn more intensely with more involvement from myself, then there will be some fee, and that is currently under development. But my vision stands that emotional stabilization has to become an obligatory skill that we ask from anybody who works with human beings. And anybody who is interested in that can learn it, given you invest the necessary time and have developed a certain empathy, or have never lost your empathy and sensibility. And the rewards are incredible to use these methods. It's like, I sometimes call it surgery of the soul. Like, I was always fascinated by surgery. I studied medicine and I wanted to become a trauma surgeon because I always felt like, here it is so practical, it's so real, you see the immediate result of what you're doing. I mean, this applies to surgery in general. But there's another thing, that the surgeon can only put together structures. In the end, the surgeon can never really, truly, actually heal. The real healing happens through the body. The body is healing. And the same thing applies for the soul too. You can create the conditions and the environment that the soul of the person has a chance to heal. That's the real magic. And it's a very powerful metaphor. I talk more about that in my chapter, the wound metaphor, because I believe it's a very powerful metaphor to clear up a lot of these myths that we have about the soul and how human nature works, because there's so many myths, there are so many confusions and misunderstandings, and sadly psychology has made its contribution in keeping things complicated for all of us. So if you look at it like a wound, you understand, like, yes, it's about creating these right conditions. Of course, then what are the right conditions? That's of course a very complex matter. I'm not saying that is always easy to answer. But there are very straightforward, simple principles which apply for most people. So emotional stabilization is, I think, empowering everybody across the board in order to intervene when there is emotional pain. And my mission is, for now, or one part of, one of my goals is to make these methods widely available for free. That is my agenda. I believe in transparency. I emphasize that a lot now when I'm developing the online material. Is, of course, I'm giving recommendations, but you should know on what basis. What is the evidence basis? And the other thing is, you should be able to look inside the box. So the demonstrations that you find on emotioncoaching.net, I think this is something sadly revolutionary, because it seems to be so difficult for people just show methods in an easily accessible way. And of course, I'm making myself vulnerable by showing what I do, but I believe it's the only way to give competence back to the people and let people decide, and bring attention to what is actually possible beyond the superficial. And that it's and that the things are very concrete, and this is my connection with what I call the surgery of the soul. The results of that are just clear. They are usually fast, they remain, they're permanent, and are fascinating to watch. And this is the way I got fascinated about these methods. I don't know, 15 years ago, I would not have imagined that I would be so fascinated by that. If I would have studied psychology, I probably would not have been that fascinated about it anymore, because it's too complicated. It's seldomly or rarely very practical, and doesn't tell me much about the human nature. And anyway, how can I also judge something that I have not experienced myself? Maybe I would have made something very good out of it, but I have trained enough psychologists to say, like, they have seldomly surprised me. With all due respect, they have seldomly surprised me with anything fascinating that I would not have learned otherwise. I just don't feel that relevant for the work that is here at stake. So what you should take from that is, if you're not a psychologist or not a therapist, stop making yourself small. That is very dangerous. And would be missing out on what you can do with emotional wounds. So the current title is of the free material is The Art of Care for Emotional Wounds. And that says it all. You know, the emotional wounds that I have explained. The other aspect is the art of care. I believe that we're dealing with an inherently human phenomenon. There's nothing more human than our emotional apparatus by definition. So when you deal with it, you have to approach it like an art form, which means, yes, you can reach proficiency by practicing. Yes, there are guidelines, guardrails, and principles. And yes, you need a creative approach. You need your fantasy, and that has been advocated by others in the field too. This is not an entirely new idea. But I believe in that form it is fresh, so I'm inviting you to check out the website, see what are the materials. If you hear that in a while, what I'm offering there might already be far more developed than it is now in September 2019, so some of the things I'm saying might in a way be outdated. So those are a few thoughts I felt like sharing, which I perceive as important for the understanding of what matters right now if you want to do something about emotional pain. And I would like to invite you to join me on emotioncoaching.net and see what you can find that can help you to do your work and do your work with the people.